It was an ordinary afternoon when Peter decided to take his golden retriever, Max, for a walk through the woods behind his house. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the path. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the quiet hum of nature filled the air. For Peter, it was the perfect time to clear his mind after a long day at work. Max, as always, was full of energy, darting ahead along the trail. He had always been a curious dog, eager to explore every nook and cranny of their familiar surroundings. Peter smiled as he watched his furry companion race back and forth, seemingly chasing after nothing. It was one of the things he loved most about Max, the dog's boundless enthusiasm for the world around him. As they walked deeper into the forest, Peter's thoughts began to drift. He hadn't expected this little stroll to be anything out of the ordinary. The sound of Max's paws patting softly on the dirt path was soothing, and the rustling of the leaves above added to the peacefulness of the moment. But then, something changed. Max suddenly stopped in his tracks. Peter noticed the dog's ears pricking up, and his tail began to wag furiously. Before Peter could react, Max bolted off the path and into the underbrush, disappearing between the trees with surprising speed. "Max," Peter called out, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "Where are you going?" Peter tried to follow, but the thick underbrush made it difficult to move quickly. The dog's barking grew louder, and Peter's heart began to race. He had never seen Max act this way before, so urgently. Something was definitely off. Pushing his way through the branches, Peter stumbled into a small clearing. His eyes scanned the area, and his breath caught in his chest. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure he couldn't quite comprehend. At first, Peter thought it was a person, maybe another hiker or someone lost in the woods. But as he looked closer, he realized that the figure was unlike anything he had ever seen. She was tall, with pale, almost translucent skin that shimmered faintly in the fading light. Her eyes were large and dark, almost black, but with a strange depth that made Peter feel as though she could see right through him. Max was sitting beside her, looking up at her with an expression of calm familiarity, as if this were just another part of their usual routine. Peter blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Max," Peter whispered, taking a cautious step forward. The dog looked up at him, then back at the figure, wagging his tail in approval. It was as though Max had known her for years, as though there was no fear, no hesitation, just a deep, unspoken bond. The alien girl, if that was what she was, didn't move, but her gaze shifted towards Peter. She studied him quietly, her expression unreadable. Her clothing was unlike anything Peter had ever seen. It seemed to shift in color, like liquid metal, with patterns that swirled and changed depending on the light. It was beautiful and strange, almost too perfect to belong to this world. Peter's mind raced. What was going on? How had she gotten here? And more importantly, what was her connection to Max? "Oh, hello," Peter called out, his voice shaky but determined. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the girl didn't speak. Instead, she simply tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words. Her eyes never left his, and in that moment, Peter felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He couldn't explain it. He was standing in front of someone completely out of his world, and yet he felt no fear, just a deep, unsettling curiosity. Max stood up and trotted over to Peter's side, nudging his leg as if to reassure him. The dog seemed unbothered by the strange presence, his tail still wagging happily. Peter reached down to scratch Max's head, but his attention remained fixed on the girl. She didn't move, but there was something in her posture, something in the way she held herself that told Peter she wasn't frightened. In fact, she seemed to be waiting for something. Peter took another cautious step forward, his mind spinning with questions. "Who are you? How did you get here?" he asked, trying to break the silence. But the girl didn't answer. Instead, she took a step towards him, her movements graceful and deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. Max suddenly bounded ahead, happily running in circles around the girl. She smiled softly, a small curve of her lips that almost seemed to glow in the dimming light. Peter watched in disbelief. The dog and the alien girl shared an unspoken connection, something that was beyond human comprehension. It was as if they communicated in a way that Peter could never understand. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustling of the trees, the occasional bark from Max, and the deep silence of the forest around them. Peter stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. All he knew was that his dog had found something, or someone, unexpected in these woods, and somehow his life was about to change forever. Peter stood frozen, watching as Max happily ran in circles around the alien girl. The strange, otherworldly figure did not seem frightened by Max's energetic antics. Instead, she watched him with an intensity that felt almost affectionate, as if she understood him in ways that Peter couldn't even begin to fathom. The air around them was heavy with the kind of silence that made Peter feel both uneasy and strangely calm at the same time. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was a strange sense of peace settling over him, a quiet assurance that he wasn't in immediate danger. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something much larger than himself. Max finally stopped his circling and trotted back to Peter's side, sitting obediently and looking up at him with a soft, trusting gaze. Peter knelt down, his hand still on Max's head, and tried to make sense of what was happening. The alien girl hadn't spoken a word since he'd first noticed her. She hadn't even moved, except for a slight tilt of her head when he'd spoken. It was as though she was waiting for something, waiting for him to make the next move. Peter slowly rose to his feet, glancing from Max to the girl. Her eyes were so dark and deep, they seemed almost like black pools of water, reflecting everything around her. There was something undeniably captivating about her gaze, something that made Peter feel like he was being drawn into a world he didn't understand. He swallowed hard, trying to collect his thoughts. "Are you lost?" Peter finally asked, his voice quiet but steady. He wasn't sure what else to say, but he had to try. It was the most logical question that came to mind. After all, she was standing alone in the woods with a dog that clearly knew her. Was she some kind of traveler, or maybe someone who had accidentally ended up here? The alien girl didn't respond verbally. Instead, she raised a delicate hand, pointing toward the woods in front of her. Peter followed her gaze, but all he saw were the trees, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. It didn't look like anything special, just the familiar forest path that he had walked down countless times. Peter furrowed his brow. "Are you trying to tell me something?" he asked. He didn't know why he was speaking so casually to her. Maybe it was the way she made him feel, like everything was okay, even though nothing about this situation was normal. He glanced back at Max, who was still sitting calmly by his side, watching the girl with those knowing eyes. Max gave a small woof, as if to affirm something, and Peter couldn't help but smile. The dog always had a way of knowing what to do, and right now, he seemed perfectly comfortable with the alien girl. Peter felt a pang of curiosity mixed with concern. Why was this happening? Why was Max acting as if he'd known her all along? The girl's gaze shifted to Peter, and for the first time, she took a step toward him. Her movement was slow, deliberate, like she was measuring each step with care. Peter tensed slightly, not sure what to expect. But the girl didn't come too close. She stopped just a few feet away, standing still and studying him with that same intense look. Peter realized that he had never felt this nervous and calm at the same time. The part of him that was filled with questions, endless questions about who she was, where she came from, and what she wanted, was slowly being overshadowed by a strange sense of trust. It was as though his instinct, deep down, was telling him that this alien girl was not here to harm him. But why was she here? Max seemed to sense the question forming in Peter's mind. The dog stood up and trotted over to the girl, nudging her gently with his nose. The alien girl bent down slightly, and to Peter's amazement, she began to stroke Max's fur, her fingers moving with a tenderness that seemed almost too human for someone who wasn't from Earth. Max closed his eyes, leaning into the touch as if he had been waiting for it all along. Peter's thoughts raced. There was no way this was a coincidence. Max had led him right to her, and now the dog was as comfortable with her as if he had known her for years. Was this some kind of cosmic connection, a bond between the two of them that went beyond anything Peter could understand? "Max," Peter whispered, feeling both confused and oddly reassured by the dog's calm behavior. The dog looked up at him, eyes full of trust, and Peter had a strange sense that Max was telling him everything was going to be okay. The dog didn't seem to be afraid of the alien girl. In fact, it seemed like they shared an understanding that Peter was missing. The girl stood up straight, her eyes never leaving Peter. She didn't speak, but her expression softened. For a moment, Peter thought she might be smiling, though it was difficult to tell for sure. There was something ethereal about her, something that made her presence both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Peter didn't know what to do next. The situation was so far beyond anything he could have imagined that it almost felt unreal. And yet, standing there in the fading light of the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something incredible. Max let out another soft woof, his tail wagging gently, and Peter took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. Something had happened, something that had brought him and his dog to this mysterious alien girl, and he knew that whatever came next, his life would never be the same again. The days following the strange encounter in the forest were a blur for Peter. Every time he looked at Max, the golden retriever seemed to be different, more attuned to something he couldn't quite grasp. It was as though the dog shared an unspoken understanding with the alien girl, a bond that Peter was only just beginning to comprehend. After bringing the girl, who Peter had started referring to as Lyra, back to his home that evening, things had been quiet. She had accepted the food he offered, though she ate little, watching Peter and Max with an intensity that left him feeling both curious and uneasy. Lyra never spoke, but there was something about the way she communicated, something that was beyond words. The way her eyes followed his every movement, the way Max's behavior shifted when she was near, all pointed to a deeper connection, one that Peter didn't fully understand. Over the next few days, Peter tried his best to communicate with her. He had tried talking to her in English, but she didn't respond to the language. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and thoughtful. Peter tried other methods, using gestures, pointing at objects, and asking simple questions. But Lyra remained silent, though her eyes seemed to be considering everything he did. Peter began to notice that Lyra had a way of mimicking his movements. If he stretched his arms, she would do the same. If he sat down, she would mirror his actions, sitting calmly and watching him. At first, Peter thought it was just coincidence, but after a few more times, he began to wonder if it was something more deliberate. Lyra seemed to be paying close attention to everything he did, almost as if she were trying to learn from him, to understand him. One afternoon, while Peter was sitting in his living room, reading a book, Max padded over to Lyra, who was sitting on the floor near the window. The dog sat down beside her, then nudged her gently with his nose, urging her to move. Peter watched, intrigued, as Lyra looked down at the dog. There was a brief moment of silence before Lyra extended her hand toward Max's head, petting him gently. Max wagged his tail, clearly content, and Peter noticed that Lyra's movements were much more fluid now, more natural. It was then that Peter realized something incredible. Lyra was learning. Not just observing, but actively learning. She wasn't simply mimicking. She was processing, understanding, and adapting to the world around her. And it wasn't just the action she was observing. There was something deeper happening between her and Max, something that Peter couldn't explain. The following day, Peter decided to test his theory. He grabbed a ball from the corner of the room and tossed it across the floor. Max immediately ran after it, his playful nature taking over. But to Peter's surprise, Lyra stood up and walked over to where the ball had rolled. She bent down and picked it up with an awkward but determined motion, just as Max would have. It wasn't perfect, but it was an incredible sign of progress. Lyra was starting to understand how things worked here, in this strange world she had found herself in. Peter couldn't believe it. She was learning at an astonishing rate. It was as if the presence of Max, his loyal, intelligent dog, was unlocking something in Lyra, something that allowed her to absorb information quickly and adapt to her surroundings. The way she moved, the way she studied Max's behavior, it all pointed to an incredible connection between them, one that seemed to transcend language, culture, and even species. As the days went by, Peter noticed that Lyra became more comfortable in the house. She seemed to be growing more confident, and Peter couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for her quiet strength. There was a calmness about her that made him feel at ease, even though he knew she was not from this world. She had a grace and an aura of wisdom, as though she had seen things that Peter couldn't even begin to imagine. One evening, as the sun began to set, and the room was bathed in soft, golden light, Peter decided to try something different. He had been thinking about it for days, wondering if perhaps Lyra could somehow communicate with him in a way other than physical gestures. Max, sensing that Peter was about to try something new, sat quietly beside him. Peter turned to Lyra, his heart beating a little faster. "Lyra," he said, his voice calm but firm, "can you understand me?" For the first time, Lyra's expression shifted. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his question. Then, without warning, she reached out and placed a hand on Max's head. The dog closed his eyes, clearly enjoying the touch, but Peter couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Max was, after all, the key to their communication. Peter looked from Lyra to Max, trying to make sense of it. "Are you using Max to understand me?" he asked, unsure of how else to phrase it. Lyra's gaze remained steady, but Peter could see a flicker of something in her eyes, something that felt almost like recognition. She was understanding him, but in a way that was beyond words, beyond speech. She was using the bond she shared with Max to bridge the gap between their worlds. Peter sat back in his chair, a mix of awe and confusion filling his mind. He was beginning to understand that Lyra wasn't just a stranger from another world. She was a being capable of connecting with those around her in ways that went beyond the limits of language. And Max, his loyal dog, was playing a key role in that connection. As the evening wore on, Peter couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. There was so much more to learn about Lyra, about Max, and about the strange connection between them. But for now, all Peter could do was sit and watch, as the dog and the alien girl shared a bond that seemed to defy everything he had ever known. Peter had never felt so uncertain about anything in his life. The more time he spent with Lyra, the more the strange bond between her and Max became impossible to ignore. The connection was deeper than anything Peter had ever experienced, and it wasn't just physical. There was an emotional element to it, too. It was as though Max and Lyra shared a silent language that Peter couldn't understand, but that he felt drawn to. Every day, Lyra seemed to grow more comfortable in Peter's home. She was learning, absorbing everything around her at an extraordinary rate. It was clear that she wasn't just some lost traveler from another world. She was something else entirely. But what exactly was she? And why had she chosen to follow Max home that day? Peter's thoughts were constantly on Lyra, but the more he observed her, the more questions he had. There were times when she seemed almost otherworldly. She would often stare out of the window, watching the sky with an expression of deep contemplation. It was as though she could see something beyond the stars, something far beyond what Peter could comprehend. Max, for his part, was still as loyal as ever, but Peter could tell the dog's behavior had changed since Lyra had arrived. Max seemed to be acting with a new sense of purpose. He no longer just ran around with his usual playful energy. Instead, he often stood near Lyra, watching her with a calm intensity that Peter couldn't explain. It was as though Max was no longer just a dog. He had become a guardian of sorts, standing watch over Lyra as if he understood something Peter didn't. One afternoon, Peter decided to take a walk in the forest with both Max and Lyra. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve, but something inside him told him that the forest was where the answers lay. Maybe if he spent more time with Lyra in the place where they first met, he could learn more about her and the strange connection between her and Max. The walk was peaceful at first. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly above them. Max walked happily by Peter's side, his tail wagging as he sniffed the ground. Lyra, however, was quiet and still, walking behind them with a calm demeanor. Every so often, she would glance up at the sky, her dark eyes filled with something Peter couldn't place. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Peter felt a sudden chill in the air. It was subtle, but it was enough to make him stop and look around. Max, as usual, seemed unaffected, but Lyra's posture stiffened, and her eyes narrowed as she scanned the surrounding trees. Something was different about this part of the forest, something that made Peter uneasy. "Lyra?" Peter asked, his voice a little hesitant. "What's going on?" Lyra didn't respond right away. She simply continued to look around, her eyes scanning every tree, every shadow. Max, too, had stopped walking and was now standing still, his ears perked up. The dog's usual carefree nature was gone, replaced by an intense focus. Peter felt a knot form in his stomach. What was happening? Suddenly, Lyra reached out, gently placing a hand on Max's head. The dog didn't flinch or move, but instead, he closed his eyes as if he were receiving some kind of signal. Peter watched in awe, not understanding what was happening, but feeling that something important was about to unfold. Lyra's eyes met Peter's then, and for the first time since she had arrived, she spoke. It was a soft, melodic voice, and her words were strangely comforting, though Peter could not understand them. At first, Peter thought she was speaking in a language he couldn't recognize, but then, as the words flowed from her lips, he felt something shift in the air around them. It wasn't just her voice. It was the way the words seemed to resonate within him, as if they were unlocking something buried deep inside his mind. He didn't know how, but he could feel her presence, her emotions, in a way that went beyond anything logical or physical. "Max," Peter whispered, looking down at his dog. "What's going on?" Max lifted his head and looked at Peter, his expression calm and understanding. Peter felt a sudden clarity, as if he was starting to grasp something he had missed before. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a part of something larger, something that connected him to Lyra, to this alien girl who had appeared out of nowhere. And somehow, Peter was now a part of it, too. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Peter. She extended her hand, and for a moment, Peter hesitated. But then, without thinking, he reached out and took it. The moment their hands touched, Peter felt an overwhelming surge of warmth, comfort, peace, and an undeniable connection. It was as if the space between them had vanished, leaving only the bond they shared. Through Lyra's gaze, Peter saw flashes of images, places he didn't recognize, people who weren't from Earth, and a vastness that made his heart race. He saw the stars, distant galaxies, and a civilization far beyond what humanity had ever imagined. And in that moment, Peter understood. Lyra wasn't just an alien from another world. She was a part of something far greater, something that reached across the universe itself. Max, too, seemed to sense this understanding. The dog moved closer, sitting beside Peter and Lyra, his tail gently wagging. It was as though he knew that this moment, this connection, was the key to something much larger than themselves. Peter felt the weight of it, the realization that everything was about to change. "I don't understand," Peter whispered, but the words felt empty now. He didn't need to understand. It was enough to feel it, to know that he was standing on the edge of something extraordinary. Lyra smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and nodded. Peter could sense that she had been waiting for him to reach this point, to understand the bond that had been forming between them all along. As they stood there in the quiet forest, with Max by their side, Peter realized that the world he knew was not the only world that existed. And whatever happened next, he was ready to face it, with Lyra, with Max, and with the connection that had brought them all together. The next few days felt surreal to Peter. Everything around him seemed the same, yet nothing was. Lyra's presence in his life had changed everything. Max was different too. The dog had become more aware of things, almost too aware, like he could sense what was coming before it happened. And Peter, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something enormous, unsure of how far he would have to fall to truly understand it. Lyra had been quiet since their walk in the woods. She had retreated into herself, spending long hours in silence, staring out of the window or sitting beside Max, her expression unreadable. Peter had tried to talk to her, but every time he attempted a conversation, she only responded with a glance or a gesture. He was beginning to wonder if she even spoke at all. But then, on the 5th day, everything changed. It was late in the afternoon when Peter came home from work. The house was quiet, unusually so. Max wasn't waiting by the door to greet him as he usually did. A sense of unease settled over him, and he quickly made his way through the house, calling out for the dog and Lyra. But there was no answer. He found them in the living room, sitting in the same spot where they had spent many quiet afternoons together. Lyra was sitting on the floor, her legs crossed beneath her, with Max lying beside her, his head resting on her lap. Peter stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. There was something about the scene that felt different, something that didn't make sense. Lyra's gaze met Peter's, and for the first time since their encounter, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet strength to it, a calmness that made Peter feel like she was about to reveal something he had been waiting for without realizing it. "You want to know why I am here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter's heart skipped a beat, but he nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had always known there was something more to her story, something important that she hadn't shared yet. And now, it seemed, the time had come. Lyra's eyes softened as she continued. "I was sent to this world, not as a stranger, but as part of a mission." Peter stepped closer, his mind racing. "A mission?" he repeated. "What kind of mission?" Lyra nodded slowly, her fingers gently running through Max's fur. "My people are explorers. We travel across galaxies, learning about other civilizations. We observe, we understand, and we make connections." She paused, her gaze turning inward for a moment, as though the weight of what she was saying was not easy for her to share. Peter sat down on the couch, his eyes never leaving her. He had so many questions, but he didn't interrupt. This was her story, and it was clear that she needed to tell it in her own way. "I wasn't sent here to invade or to conquer," she continued, her voice steady. "I was sent here to learn, to observe how beings like you, humans, live and interact. My people believe in connection, the connection between hearts, minds, and even souls. We believe that the future of the universe lies in our ability to understand each other, to form bonds that transcend the barriers of our differences." Peter absorbed her words, his thoughts swirling. "So, you're not a scout for an invasion or anything like that?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "No," Lyra said softly, shaking her head. "I'm not here for war. I'm here for peace, but my mission is complicated. The connection between me and your world, it is deeper than just observation. It's about understanding how humanity fits into the larger web of existence." Peter leaned back, trying to wrap his mind around what she was saying. It was all so much to take in. He had thought she was just a lost traveler, someone who had accidentally ended up on Earth. But this was something far bigger than that. This was about the future of humanity, the future of the universe itself. Max lifted his head from Lyra's lap and looked at Peter, his eyes calm and knowing. Peter met the dog's gaze, and in that moment, everything clicked into place. Max wasn't just a companion. He wasn't just Lyra's guide. Max was the key to unlocking the connection between Lyra and Peter, between their world and hers. The bond between me and your dog, Lyra explained, is not by chance. Max was chosen, in a way. His spirit, his connection to you, Peter, made him the perfect conduit. He is the link between our worlds. He's not just a pet. He's a guide, a bridge, and an ambassador in ways you cannot yet understand. Peter's heart raced. He turned to Max, who was now sitting up, his eyes alert and steady. The dog had always been special, but now Peter understood that Max's connection to Lyra, and to him, was something far beyond the ordinary. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Peter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt a mix of awe and frustration. Why had Lyra kept all this from him? "I couldn't," she replied softly. "You weren't ready. I needed you to see it, to feel it. The connection between us isn't just words. It's something that can only be understood through time, through shared experience." Peter sat in silence for a moment, processing everything she had said. His life had changed in ways he never could have imagined, and now he understood that the journey he was on wasn't just about helping Lyra. It was about discovering the truth of his own place in the universe. "So, what now?" Peter asked, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. "What happens next?" Lyra smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Now we learn. Together." The days after Lyra's revelation were filled with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Peter's life had completely changed. Every day felt like a new chapter, a new discovery. But the more Peter learned about Lyra's mission, the more questions seemed to surface. What exactly did this all mean for Earth? What was humanity's role in the grand scheme of things? And why had Lyra chosen him and Max to be part of it? Lyra had been open about one thing. Her mission was far from simple. She was not just an observer. Her people, the ones who sent her to Earth, believed that the universe could only thrive through connection, understanding the ties that bound different species together. Lyra had been sent to Earth to see if humans were capable of that kind of understanding, that kind of peaceful connection. And now she was part of something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. Peter couldn't deny the importance of Lyra's mission, but it also weighed heavily on him. He had always thought of Earth as a small part of the universe, a planet with its own struggles, its own issues. But now he realized that Earth's future was tied to something much larger. The entire galaxy, or perhaps even galaxies beyond it, were watching, waiting to see if humanity was ready to take the next step. One afternoon, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Lyra sat with Max in the backyard, gazing up at the stars. Peter watched them from the kitchen window, his mind filled with the weight of the knowledge Lyra had shared. He had been thinking a lot about the future, about what would happen if humanity was found wanting. Would Earth be left behind? Would it be forever isolated from the greater community of the universe? Peter had always been a curious man. He had always wanted to know more about the world around him, to understand the mysteries of life, but nothing in his past could have prepared him for the enormity of what Lyra had revealed. She wasn't just an alien girl who had wandered into his life by chance. She was a messenger, an ambassador for a civilization that had seen the potential in humanity. And yet, Peter still wasn't sure if humanity was ready for what was being asked of them. As the evening wore on, Peter decided to join Lyra and Max outside. The cool evening breeze carried with it a sense of calm, but Peter couldn't shake the feeling that something important was coming. He walked outside and approached Lyra, who was still sitting cross-legged in the grass. Max, ever the loyal companion, stood up and trotted over to Peter, his tail wagging in greeting. "Lyra," Peter began, sitting down beside her, "I've been thinking about what you said, about your mission, about what's at stake here." Lyra turned to him, her dark eyes filled with a quiet understanding. She didn't speak, but her presence alone made Peter feel as though she were listening to his every word. "I don't know what's going to happen," Peter continued. "I don't know if humanity is ready for this kind of change. We got so many problems, so much conflict. How can we ever be ready to connect with the universe if we can't even connect with each other? Lyra smiled softly, her expression gentle. She placed a hand on Max's head, and the dog nuzzled her affectionately. Peter watched the scene unfold, the connection between the two of them undeniable. There was a deep understanding in the way Lyra interacted with Max, a quiet bond that spoke volumes. "You're wrong," Lyra said softly, her voice calm but firm. "You're not seeing it clearly. Your people already have the capacity for connection. It's in your nature, in your hearts. The problem isn't that humans are incapable of understanding one another. The problem is that you've forgotten how." Peter looked at her, confused. "Forgotten how?" Lyra nodded. "Yes, you've been so focused on division, on differences, that you've forgotten the power of unity. But it's there, Peter. It's always been there. That's why Max and I are here. To remind you." Peter sat in silence for a moment, processing her words. He had always believed in the good of people, in the potential for kindness and understanding, but it was hard to see it in the world around him. The conflicts, the misunderstandings, the hate, it all seemed so overwhelming at times. But Lyra was right, wasn't she? Maybe humanity hadn't lost the ability to connect. Maybe it had just forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, he was part of something that could help people remember. "What do we do?" Peter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we help people remember?" Lyra smiled, her gaze softening. "You already are, Peter. The bond you share with Max, the way he has become a bridge between our worlds, that is the first step. Your connection to him, to me, to each other, that is the foundation for everything else. Once people begin to understand the power of those connections, they will start to see the bigger picture." Peter looked down at Max, who was sitting beside him, watching the conversation unfold with a calm expression. The dog had always been more than just a pet to him. He had always been a loyal companion, a friend. But now, Peter saw him as something more, something greater. Max was the key to understanding, the bridge that connected their world to something far beyond it. "We have to show them," Peter said, determination growing in his voice. "We have to help people see that there is more to the universe than just us, that we're all connected." Lyra nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we are here. Together, we will remind humanity of the connections that bind all living things across all worlds. We will show them that peace, understanding, and unity are not just possible. They are the future." Peter felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since he had met Lyra, he felt hopeful. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone in this journey. With Lyra, with Max, and with the bond they shared, he had the power to help make a difference, not just for Earth, but for the entire universe. The days after Peter's conversation with Lyra were filled with an unusual calm. He felt a sense of purpose growing inside him, something he had never felt before. Lyra's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that the key to the future was in the connections they formed, not just with each other, but with the world beyond. Peter had always thought of himself as a quiet observer, someone who didn't take part in grand schemes or make waves. But now he realized that he had been chosen, along with Max, to play a role in something much bigger than he could have imagined. His connection with Max, his bond with Lyra, was part of a larger mission that spanned the universe. They were helping to bridge the gap between worlds, to create understanding where there had been only distance and confusion. Lyra continued to teach Peter about her people, about the connections they believed in, and about the universe beyond their small corner of it. She spoke of worlds that had once been divided, civilizations that had once been at war, but had found peace through understanding and unity. It was a beautiful vision, one that filled Peter with a sense of wonder and hope. One evening, as the three of them sat together on the porch, watching the stars above, Peter turned to Lyra with a question that had been on his mind for days. "Lyra," he began, his voice thoughtful, "how do we know if we're ready? How do we know when we've made a true connection? What if people aren't ready for what you're offering? Lyra looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a depth that seemed to stretch beyond the stars themselves. That's the challenge, Peter, she said softly. People don't always see what they need until they are ready. But you don't give up on them just because they don't see it yet. You show them, little by little, that the connection is there, waiting for them to notice. The key is to be patient, to lead by example. Peter nodded, understanding what she meant. It wasn't about forcing people to see things the way he saw them. It was about guiding them, giving them the chance to see for themselves, and allowing them to make the choice. If humanity was ready to understand, if they were ready to embrace the idea of unity, they would find their way. If not, they would need more time, more patience, and more understanding. The next few weeks were a blur of small moments, moments that seemed insignificant on their own, but were actually part of the larger picture. Peter began to share the message Lyra had given him with those around him. He started with the people he knew best, his friends, his family. He didn't speak of aliens or intergalactic missions. Instead, he spoke of the importance of connection, of understanding, and of finding common ground with people who were different. It was a simple message, but one that resonated deeply with those who heard it. And surprisingly, the message spread. Peter didn't know how it happened, but people began talking. They started having conversations about what it meant to be connected, what it meant to understand one another, despite differences. They began asking questions, questions that had never occurred to them before. Peter found himself part of a quiet movement, a shift in thinking that was slowly but surely taking hold. Meanwhile, Lyra had become a fixture in Peter's life. She continued to observe, to learn, and to teach in ways that were subtle but powerful. She never forced herself into the conversation, but her presence was always felt. When people saw her, they saw someone who was different, but also someone who could connect with them in ways they couldn't fully explain. Lyra had a way of making people feel at ease, of making them feel like they were part of something larger. Max, as always, remained by their side, the steady presence that connected them all. The dog had become the symbol of the bond between Peter and Lyra, a constant reminder that sometimes the simplest connections were the most profound. Max's loyalty, his gentle spirit, was a reflection of the lesson they were all learning. That connection was not about grand gestures or lofty ideals. It was about the small, everyday moments that brought people together. One afternoon, as Peter walked through the park with Max, he overheard a conversation between two strangers. They were talking about the changes they had been seeing in their community, how people seemed more willing to listen to one another, how tensions had eased between groups that had been divided for so long. The shift was subtle, but it was happening. And Peter realized that, despite the uncertainty and doubt he had felt in the beginning, change was already underway. Lyra had been right. The connections were already there, waiting to be discovered. It wasn't about waiting for the world to change all at once. It was about creating small moments of connection that could grow over time. As the weeks turned into months, Peter watched as his world, and the world around him, began to shift. People were talking, connecting, and understanding in ways they never had before. The future, once uncertain, now seemed filled with possibility. There was still much work to be done, but Peter had faith that humanity was ready to embrace the idea of unity. They were ready to see the bigger picture, to understand that they were not alone in the universe, and that the connections they shared with each other, and with all living things, were the key to a brighter future. And in that future, Peter knew, there would always be Max by his side, and Lyra too. Together, they had started something that would echo through the universe, a reminder that peace, understanding, and connection were possible, if only people were willing to look for them.